All right. Thank you for that. We're going to switch gears now to another virtual speaker who's going to come. And actually, it gives me great pleasure to introduce the next speaker, who I've had the pleasure of working with a number of years ago when I was in San Francisco at UCSF. This is Dr. Katherine Possin, who's a clinical psychologist who will talk to us about race-based norms for athletes with concussion. She is focused on improving the detection, diagnosis, and care for people with neurodegenerative disease, and has a long-standing interest in understanding the cognitive impairments and their neural basis in neurodegenerative diseases, including Alzheimer's, Lewy body disease, Huntington's, chronic traumatic encephalopathy, and frontotemporal lobar degeneration. She's the project lead of TabCat, which is a software platform for tablet-based cognitive testing, frequently used in research studies and clinical services. The brain health assessment is a 10-minute assessment that's designed for detecting cognitive impairment in everyday clinical settings. She's the principal investigator of the CARE ecosystem, which is a telephone-based supportive care program for persons with dementia and their caregivers, and is a faculty member at the Global Brain Health Institute. She was awarded her PhD in clinical psychology from UCS San Diego, and during her training at UC San Diego, she studied cognitive changes associated with Parkinson's disease. She completed her internship at UCSF in the departments of psychiatry and neurology, and did her postdoctoral fellowship at the UCSF Department of Neurology. She currently holds the John Douglas French Alzheimer's Foundation Endowed Professorship and is an associate professor in residence at the Department of Neurology. She is accepting applications for postdoc fellowship in neuropsychology and postdoctoral fellowship in dementia and healthcare innovation. So I give you Dr. Kate Possin, hopefully.
Yes, can you hear me okay?
Yes, I can.
Oh, good. Thank you so much for inviting me. It's just really good to be able to speak with you all today about the perils of race-based norms in cognitive testing, the case of former NFL players. So in August of 2020, Ken Belson from the New York Times broke the story that two retired NFL players, Najee Davenport and Kevin Henry, had accused the NFL of explicitly and deliberately discriminating against hundreds, if not thousands, of Black players who filed dementia-related claims in the landmark concussion settlement. So making it harder for them to qualify for payouts because they were Black. So Najee Davenport, pictured here, his neurocognitive exam found that his executive functioning was diminished enough to qualify for compensation. But then the NFL appealed the award and said that when his scores were recalculated, accounting for his Black race, he was ineligible for a payout. So the reason I'm here speaking here with you today is not because I'm a concussion expert, I'm not, but I'm a neuropsychologist, and as you heard, I'm a dementia researcher. And when I heard about this, just reading it in the New York Times like everybody else, I was concerned about what I perceived to be a dangerous misuse of race norms. And perhaps that there was also an opportunity to rethink neuropsychology's approach. So I wrote this short opinion piece that contributed to what was a lot of press in the following months on this topic, with a lot of public outrage. So I'm going to tell you this story today. So I'll start by reminding you all what the landmark concussion settlement was. Then I'll describe what are race norms and how they were used under the settlement agreement, talk a little bit about the history of race norms, and perhaps a better way forward for the field. So the landmark NFL concussion settlement, in the master complaint, the NFL was accused of minimizing and suppressing awareness of the link between subconcussive and concussive injuries in football and neurocognitive damage. Under the settlement agreement, the NFL agreed to pay damages for retirees who could demonstrate that they suffer from one of several covered brain conditions. So payments could be as high as $5 million, but were adjusted down based on a variety of factors. So payments were higher if you were younger, if you had more years in the league, more severe dementia. So before we discuss race norms and how they were used in the settlement agreement, let's just first review how neuropsychologists use normative data to determine if a patient is impaired. So to determine cognitive impairment, neuropsychologists compare a patient's cognitive test performance to their estimated baseline cognitive abilities. So how do we estimate baseline abilities? Well, typically what we do is we look at data, for example, on a memory test from a large sample of neurologically healthy individuals. So you can imagine this bell curve of performance on a memory test in the normal population. And let's say your patient scores 2 standard deviations below the mean. Well, the neuropsych, you might consider that patient as impaired. So that's how we use normative standards. So but normative standards typically adjust for demographic factors that are known to relate to performance, typically age, sex, and education. For example, you might have a different bell curve for an 80-year-old patient than a bell curve for a 50-year-old patient. Another approach is to statistically adjust for these demographic factors. But when race norms are used, a different standard is used for Blacks and whites. So you compare a Black patient to a bell curve based on the performance of Black individuals, and you have a different curve for white individuals. So a different standard is used. So the NFL was accused of requiring that the evaluators assume that Black players started at a lower cognitive baseline. And so they had to score lower than whites on the same test to qualify for the monetary award. So more specifically, the settlement agreement had a neuropsychology protocol that the examiners had to follow, and it adjusted for race in 2 ways. The first was that baseline cognitive abilities were classified as above average, average, or below average. This is just before the patient even starts doing their tests. So this classification of what their baseline IQ or baseline cognitive abilities were based on demographics, including race, Black or white, binary, and performance on an irregular reading test. So this classification benchmarked the level of cognitive impairment needed to qualify. And in addition, a subset of the cognitive tests were further adjusted for race using what are known as the Heaton norms. And these norms correct for Black race based on a sample from San Diego in the 1990s. So when race is used at either step in this process, the assumption is that a Black player started at a lower cognitive baseline. So a Black player with the same cognitive scores as a white player who played together on the same fields is assumed to have suffered less cognitive impairment. So the case of race norms in the NFL is reminiscent of a damaging century-long history of assuming that differences on intelligence tests, or IQ, are primarily inherited, and then using this false assumption to legitimize unequal distribution of resources by social class. For example, the Army Alpha and Beta tests, which were given to over 1 million soldiers during World War I, identified lower intelligence test performance from Blacks and recent immigrants. So Italians and Polish were considered to be less intelligent than Northern Europeans. The bell curve was a very influential text from 1994. It argued that intelligence is substantially inherited and is a better predictor of occupational success than an individual's parental socioeconomic status. And after controlling for IQ, they showed that statistically many race differences in social outcomes were diminished. But of course, I think many of us would think that these analyses were backwards in terms of what was assumed to be causing what. The Human Genome Project has taught us that human beings are very similar at the DNA level, and the variation does not vary according to these socio-politically defined race categories in a way that would explain intelligence differences. So if biologically based differences in intelligence by race have been debunked, why use race norms? Race norms were developed as a crude proxy for lifelong social experience. They were developed by neuropsychologists in the 1990s to reduce harms that can result from the over-identification of cognitive impairment among Black individuals and other marginalized racial or ethnic groups. So while they were developed to reduce harm, they can also cause harm. And extreme caution must be exerted when race norms could lead to denial of services because perhaps a diagnosis is missed, or in this case, a monetary award. The misuse of race norms perpetuates the false idea that race is a scientific entity and that there are race-based biological differences in intelligence. So in 2021, the NFL and lawyers for thousands of retired NFL players reached an agreement to end race-based adjustments in cognitive testing related to the landmark concussion settlement agreement. And as of August 2022, 646 players had submitted new claims. And of these, about half went from not qualifying for anything or from a lower award to a higher award just by removing race norms. So that this shows how significant of an effect the race norms were having on determining awards. So where do we go from here? What should we do instead of race norms? Well, first, I think those of you who are clinicians, you know that a diagnosis of dementia should not be based on some plug and play formula. It's a clinical diagnosis that's based on clinical history, function, neuroexam, lab findings, and social context in addition to test scores. But in terms of norms, we need to unpack race. It's not race that's causing these differences in baseline cognition. So we need to unpack it, and we need to explicitly measure and adjust for social determinants of brain health. Fortunately, there has been increasing interest in measuring social determinants of health in large cohort studies. And I expect that we will learn a lot in the coming years about how social factors and their interactions predict cognitive test performance in diverse groups of individuals. And this may lead to a more precise and ethically appropriate approach. So in closing, I urge you as a scientist to speak up, to increase awareness about your work as it's relevant to the public. And when you see scientific practices being misused, make your voice heard. I want to thank my colleagues at the UCSF Memory and Aging Center, and I want to thank you all for your attention today.
Thank you so much. And, we're so happy to hear that, so many more people were awarded because of a change in practice. So I'll look to our audience if there's any questions.
Thank you so much for your talk and for this really game-changing work. It was so impactful, what you did. And I'm wondering, and I agree, I'm a neuropsychologist, and I agree with you that the origin of the race-based norms was, the motivation was positive. It was to protect people. But the reality was it was just a really coarse proxy for these social determinants that you've been talking about. And obviously race doesn't have to do with anything to do with intelligence. But what I'm wondering is what you would recommend now. So we've got this, we're kind of in we don't have any great proxies or measures for the factors that do play this causal role, like measures of socioeconomic status, for example. And so I'm wondering, what do you use in a clinical neuropsychological assessment right now?
Right. Yeah, it's a really good question because we don't have the best tools right now. I mean, I think first you want to make sure that you consider all the available information, and the degree to which your normative data is not appropriate for the patient sitting in front of you. You especially want to rely on other sources of information, like report from the family about what changes that they have noticed. In tests that I collecting norms for, we do adjust for education, absolutely. And I do adjust for language sometimes. So where I live in San Francisco, we have a lot of Spanish speakers who have recently immigrated from Mexico or Central America. And we have, separate norms that we've collected for that group, for example. So, but you use those kinds of norms with caution. You think about what is the impact of using the norms and make sure that it's in the benefit of your patient.
Do you have a tool that you use for socioeconomic status? Because that's where we really only have very outdated measures to control that. Or to
Well, I
factor that.
think, yeah, absolutely. And I actually don't have normative, the test that I use anyway, don't have normative data that correct for socioeconomic status. But I think this is an effort for a lot of research that's going on. So for example, the Alzheimer's disease research centers in the United States they have a standard data set that's collected across all of them. They're introducing a battery of social determinants of health right now that'll be collected across all. So I think we're going to have normative data in the future that can correct for these important variables, but we just don't have it right now.
Thank you. Any other questions? Let me look online. No. Actually, I do have a question. I know, are leading an initiative to do more digital biomarkers. Can you tell us a little bit about how you think some digital biomarkers may be more useful or relevant in some of these assessments?
Yeah. So absolutely. Well, one of the reasons why digital assessments have such promise is you can build in scoring algorithms into them. So when we're talking about adjusting for multiple factors, such as the social factors, as well as standard demographic factors, that's a lot to ask a clinician to do. But you can have, with digital testing, one of the things that's so great about it is you can have the scores adjusted automatically for the clinician or the researcher built into the application. So that's a real nice feature. And just in general, with the tests that I develop, I get input from cognitive experts who are living in all different parts of the world, including with a lot from low to middle income countries, rural areas, that experts that work with all different kinds of patients. And I try to develop tests that will be appropriate and work across cultures. So that's an area of work that I'm involved in. Thank you for asking.
Any other questions in the room? No? And I don't see any online. So thank you so much for joining us. I know it's actually quite early for you. So thank you for that.
All right. Well, wonderful. It was really great to be here.
Thank you. Bye.